Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we're going to take a very brief look, as we always do, a brief look at slavery, and in particular slavery from the 18th and 19th century. And the reason why I say that is because sadly with human beings we have had slavery for centuries upon centuries. Even though we often think of slavery as an 18th and 19th century thing, it is something that affected the world for thousands of years, for millennia basically. If you think back, ancient cultures would have had slaves mainly as war booty. So if you think of tribal warfare, it was normal to take slaves as hostages and then to make them work for the people, the victors basically. And we see this in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, and also in ancient Egypt. But what we must not think is the pyramids were built by the slaves of the Egyptians, because we now know 99% sure that the builders of the pyramids were actually the farm workers, the farm labourers, who found that during the flood season they were out of work, so they went to pyramid building. And that's obviously from relatively recent research. So slavery is something that's been around for a very, very long time, but we're concentrating on that particular slave trade of the 18th and 19th century. Now, just to explain it briefly, I'm going to use this map, and the reason for this map is it shows the transatlantic slave trade. So by the 18th and 19th century there was more people moving around the world than ever before, and we're not just talking about slaves. We had people from Britain that were moving to the colonies to settle down and get a new life, and we know that happened in North America, it happened in Canada, the West Indies, and places even as obscure as Africa, for example. So you have lots and lots of people moving around, and those people very simply wanted the luxury items, the trade items from home. So ships left Britain, usually with cargoes full of manufactured goods. So things like iron nails, trade axes, iron cooking pots, even guns, and things to remember or remind them of home, things like barrels and barrels of Scotch whisky. So ships would leave Britain with all these manufactured goods, and let's say we're dropping off to the colonials in Africa. So they've got to Africa, unloaded those goods, and we know for a fact that ships that are empty are less stable in the water, and ships that are empty are also making no money whatsoever. So we know people very early on decided to pick things up for the return journey. So sadly, whilst these ships are in Africa, people went ashore. There was even people living in Africa that did this as a professional job, and they would have gone out, raided little villages and tribal settlements and captured people to basically go into slavery. They would have been put in chains, and that would have been their life from that moment on. They would have been thrown into ships, and those ships with the slaves on would have sailed across the Atlantic to the West Indies and America. Why there? Well, very specific. America and the West Indies were big powerhouses, really. There were places where a lot of goods came from, a lot of the raw materials came from, and because growing sugar and things like cotton was labour intensive, it was important to have the labour force, the manpower. So very simply, the slaves left Africa, forced over to America and the West Indies, and they were put to work. They were sold to the landowners, the farming people out there, and they were put to work. And this starts the slave trade as such. This is the 18th and 19th century that we're concentrating on. Now, all the goods that were being made over here, or grown over there and cultivated over here, things like the cotton, the tobacco, the molasses, the rum and so on, would have then been transported back across the Atlantic to Great Britain. And that's why this is often referred to as the transatlantic triangle, or the transatlantic slave trade. It's because goods are being moved in this triangular formation, and that really is the gist of 18th and 19th century slavery. The slaves are the workforce for the powerful empire. Now, people knew this was going on, and some people wanted to reform it. They wanted to change this, and one of the people in particular was a man called Thomas Clarkson. Now, he had actually organised a society, And in 1787, the society was known as the Society of the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And this became their badge. It became the seal on their letters and petitions to Parliament. And in some cases, this was turned into jewellery that people wore. And women got involved in this reform as well. And it basically shows you a slave in chains. Now, William, or shall I say, Thomas Clarkson was a very clever man, because he often carried with him a large wooden chest. Now, we've got a replica of that, and that wooden chest would have been used when he gave lectures. It would have been used when he had meetings with members of Parliament, and he would open it up, and it had all the things that I just mentioned. So in it, there would be cotton, there would be things such as tobacco, there was rum, molasses, and so on. And it would be the talking point. When he did the lecture, he would take these things out, and it proved that, in a way, everyone was involved in that slave trade. For those wearing the cotton dresses, for example, those that were putting sugar in the tea, they were suddenly realising that they were all part of this problem of the transatlantic triangle. Now, Mr. Clarkson also carried with him things like slave chains, the cat o' nine tails that were used for flogging and whipping the slaves, and also he carried things like the punishment collar, and we've got one here. Now, we always believe that a picture paints 1,000 words, and it really does. So we always like to have props and artifacts that we can show to children, and if we're doing a talk for adults, they can also come up at the end and pick these things up. And as I say, it's the best way of learning, to actually handle and hold these things. And this is a punishment collar, and it's the same type that Mr. Clarkson had, and he would demonstrate its use. And what it was used for is, if you had a slave that kept running away, this could be attached very tightly around the neck here, and the thing sticking out would stop the slave from running away. Now, these are very similar to what animals had. For example, if you think of animals even in the medieval and the Tudor period, if you had, for example, sheep that kept getting out of a field by pushing through a hedge, they would often tie some branches onto the sheep, and these branches would stop the sheep from pushing through the hedgerow, for example. So the idea is this would go on the neck of the slave that keeps running away, and it would prevent him running away, because if he tries to run through very thick undergrowth, and you have to remember, if you think of, for example, the cotton plantations or the tobacco plantations, it could be in a very wooded area, or in a clearing in a wooded area. If you try and run through woods, for example, with this on, you are going to get caught up. If you try and push yourself through a hedge, it's going to get caught. And even if you try and sleep when you're on the run, you can't, because no matter how you lie, it will get in the way. It's an absolutely horrible thing. But like I said, Mr. Clarkson had things like this to try and prove to people how horrific this crime was of slavery. Now, he also had illustrations and pictures to show people, and this is one picture that he showed, because as slavery got very, very big in the 18th and the early 19th century, they were even designing ships specifically for the purpose of moving slaves. And this is one of the famous Brooks ships that could hold just over 600 people. Now, hopefully you can see that. It actually shows people, and they would have been stacked, as I always describe, very much like books on a bookcase, because people have these shelves that they actually lie on, they're chained to it, and they're chained in levels, in layers, very, very close together. We even have another illustration. This is not a Clarkson illustration, but it actually shows you what the conditions would have been like on a stinking slave ship. Absolutely horrific. Absolutely horrific. But luckily, these pictures did shock people. In the 18th and 19th century, these pictures shocked people. There was a lot of organisations that came out. They were not the only society to actually try and stop slavery. There were even petitions from lots of other people, including this copy here of a ladies' petition. Like I said, lots of people were now aware of what was going on. Mr. Clarkson was a fantastic individual. Eventually, luckily, they managed to get a few politicians on board, and one man in particular is the man that everyone thinks about when they think of the end of slavery, and it's the MP William Wilberforce, which is the man just of here. And it is quite sad, really, because when we think of slavery, we always think of William Wilberforce, but we don't actually think of Thomas Clarkson. We also know there were several African people that were also involved in the abolition of slavery. So there were surprisingly a large amount of people, not just William Wilberforce. But William Wilberforce started his political career in Kingston upon Hull, and he was a member of Parliament, and he really got behind Clarkson's idea of the abolishment of slavery, and he petitioned the whole of the government, which eventually led to certain acts coming in. 1807 was the first act that came in, really, making it illegal to purchase slaves, for example. But the big one that everyone always talks about is the 1833 Act. And the 1833 Act stopped slavery across the entire empire. It meant basically it was also illegal to own slaves. Now, the shocking thing is that the slaves were now pretty much living in America and the West Indies, and there was no way they were going to be transported back to Africa. What you have to remember, a lot of the children grew up into slavery, so they were children of slaves, so they were basically born into slavery. And the shocking thing was, the only people to technically get some compensation from the whole horrible affair of the 18th and 19th century were the slave owners, because they were the ones now out of pocket. They had purchased slaves, they had slaves working on their land, and they now had no slaves. So they were the ones that actually petitioned and tried to get a vast quantity of compensation for their losses, for example, which I think is absolutely shocking. But luckily, slavery in the 18th and 19th century came to an end. And we also have to thank also the Royal Navy for the work that they did across the sea to try and stop slavery for people outside the empire, because you have to remember this, it was banned in the British Empire, but it didn't stop it going on in places like America, for example. Anyway, that is a very brief look at slavery, and if you think back to our Monday mystery, we did actually show you a manila, and as we said, this was often used as a bartering coinage for the purchase of slaves, even though originally they were monetary bracelets that were worn by women of the wealthy Africans, for example, in particular West Africa, but then eventually across the board. Anyway, as we said, hopefully these videos will enthuse you into finding out more. So please do have a look at the transatlantic slave trade, and make sure you subscribe to our channel, and therefore you won't miss any videos in the future. So on that note, stay safe, stay in, have a good weekend, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.